now they see me. Hello world, we're streaming live. I have the chat open. If anyone watching live has questions, feel free to throw them there. If anyone in the room has questions, feel free to ask them at any time. This will be an intro and overview of FeathersJS. My email is cj@knoll.computer. It's a real internet address. That's my website. And if you're on DivderDev Slack, you can find me as CJ. That's my name. I'm a full stack developer, educator, and maker. I have worn many hats in my career, including instructor, software engineer, QA analyst, system administrator, help desk consultant, and other things too. And currently, I am a lead full stack developer at a company called 303 Software. We are a software consultancy, and we typically focus on custom product builds. So whether you're a startup or a larger company and you're looking for something built from the ground up, completely custom solutions, that's what we do. I have a YouTube channel, which is why I'm streaming right now. It's called Coding Garden with CJ. I stream regularly. I've been pretty busy lately, so I actually haven't streamed in like a week or two. But I've done streams on FeathersJS. I talk about all things JavaScript, Vue, TypeScript, React, backend stuff, databases. I have one claim to fame. I was actually live on Coding Train with Dan Schiffman a few months ago, so that was cool. I was in New York City, and I got to go be live with him. Check out Coding Train if you haven't heard of it.
Love Coding Train.
Yeah? Cool. So that's me. I'm also the co-organizer of the Denver Vue Meetup. Has anyone here been to the Denver Vue Meetup? Yeah, nice. We are looking for food sponsors, so if your company or someone you know uses Vue or wants to support the meetup, let me know. And we're also always looking for full talk and lightning talk speakers. It doesn't necessarily have to be Vue.js focused. It could be React for Vue developers, anything like that. Most talks are welcome, so just reach out to me. Let's find out, who are you? So who writes JavaScript daily? Raise a hand. Everyone, cool. Who writes backend applications? So like backend JavaScript applications. So Node.js, a little bit. Who uses Express? Anyone use like Happy.js? Cool. Anyone use like Koa? Anything else? No? GraphQL, yeah. There are lots of others. That's relevant because FeathersJS is kind of a wrapper around Node.js libraries. What else? I guess that's it. Welcome, hello, thanks for raising your hands. Our agenda for tonight is first, what is FeathersJS? We'll talk about how to set it up and configure it. Talk about some of the supported transport layers. We'll talk about what are services. We'll talk about data adapters, authentication, hooks, Feathers client, events in the Feathers client, and also the ecosystem and community. So first, what is FeathersJS? Who has heard of FeathersJS before you saw this talk on meetup.com? One person. Cool, so we're gonna learn a ton. But it is a batteries included, but entirely optional minimum web application framework. In a few slides from now, I'll show you what it's potentially comparable to see if you've heard of those things. But it's essentially a collection of Node.js modules that allow you to build backend applications, but very quickly. At its core, it is a set of tools and an architecture pattern. So you might have heard of like MVC or that type of pattern in a way of structuring your applications. Feathers doesn't do that. They came up with their own way of essentially structuring your backend application, and it works really well. It's based on services. We'll talk about that. But you can essentially generate a CRUD API in one command. So you can prototype backend APIs. You can add authentication with one command. It is really cool. So the way it does this is kind of like being the glue code. So if you have built Express applications before, the code that you're going to see will look very familiar, but they just have a standardized way of doing it, a standardized way of structuring your folders, a standardized way of adding middlewares and creating services. And it typically scales a lot better than if you were following some sort of MVC architecture. It was initially created by David Luch. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he had the initial idea for something like FeathersJS back in 2010 when he was working on his thesis. He actually initially wrote the thing in Java, But his idea was this: instead of the typical MVC paradigm, he took aspect-oriented programming patterns and settled on using services and cross-cutting concerns, or hooks. We'll talk about what all of that means. But if you're more interested in like where FeathersJS came from, I have a link here to this blog post that talks about why we built the best web framework you probably never heard of. That was posted, I think, maybe a year or so ago. It's gained a bit more traction since then. I realize you cannot see at the bottom of the screen, but if you want to access these slides, it's git.io/intro-feathers. So you can click all these links and see the stuff that I'm talking about. The initial version was published to GitHub in 2013. Version 1 was released in 2014, version 2 in 2016, and they're currently in version 3. So it's a pretty stable, production-ready framework that you can use. And let's talk about like what is this in comparison to. So on the actual FeathersJS website, they have documentation on what you might compare it to. So FeathersJS has the ability to be a real-time backend framework. So a lot of people might compare it to what you get with Firebase. It's fairly different because you are in control of the backend. You can choose what database you use. There is a client library that behaves fairly similarly to the Firebase client library, but it's different. Meteor is an isomorphic JavaScript framework, so it allows you to write JavaScript that runs both on the client and the server. FeathersJS is not that, but in a similar way, it allows you to build applications a lot quicker. You might have heard of Sails.js. Who's heard of Sails.js? So Sails is very similar to Rails, and if you're familiar with Ruby and Rails, it's a very full-featured framework that's very opinionated about where you put things and how the overall thing works. So Sails is that for JavaScript. And Feathers is a little bit like that, but one thing I'll talk about is how it has built-in support for multiple types of transports, whether it's REST APIs or sockets. Sails doesn't necessarily have that, but you can kind of compare it to that. And then also Loopback. Who's heard of or used Loopback? No? So this is from, is the organization called Loopback? The one that, yeah, so they built Express. Did they build Express? I don't know. They're well known in the Node.js community, but this is a very similar tool. It has like a CLI. You can generate an application. They have a structured way of building backend apps. So it's similar in certain ways to these things, but it is different in a lot of other ways, and we'll talk about that. So to the documentation. When you're deciding to adopt something like this for apps that you're building, you probably want to have really good documentation and a really good community behind it. Their docs are awesome. They have guides for just like getting started. They have in-depth guides for how everything works. And so it's really good documentation. Just want to point that out. And as I go through the talk, I'll kind of point out parts of the documentation that are fairly useful. Okay, setup and configuration. So the Feathers CLI is a tool that's built by the Feathers team, and it lets you initialize new applications using their recommended structure. So you could build a Feathers application just by installing it from npm and kind of configuring things in your own way, but they provide a CLI, and it kind of just jumpstarts how you get going. So you can configure auth, you can generate database-backed services. They have lots of built-in and plugins for connecting to different types of databases. You can generate hooks, which I'll talk about. You can add express middlewares, but it's really a full-featured CLI tool that lets you get moving really fast. So let's install it. I've already installed it, but if you do want to install Feathers, you can do npm install @feathers/CLI-G. That will install it globally on your machine. And then you'll have access to the Feathers CLI. If you want to generate an app, you can create a directory, go into the directory, and then when you run the command, you want to run it inside of the directory that you'd like to generate the app inside of. It's not going to create the folder, so you want to make sure that you create the folder first. Cool. There's a question in the live chat. Does anyone know how he's using a Markdown file as a presentation? Was anyone else curious about that? Maybe you didn't know. But there is this tool called Reveal MD. So all of these slides that you're seeing I actually wrote with Markdown, and then this tool turns it into a Reveal.js slide deck. So that's pretty sweet. Yes, sir. I was literally going to ask you that. Yeah, so it's cool. Yeah, and ask anything at any time. Cool. Sweet. Okay, so it installed globally. Now we can generate an app. So let's just create a to-dos API, because why not? So we're going to create a to-dos directory. Go into the to-dos directory. Is this big enough for everyone to see? Cool. And so now that we're in the to-dos directory, we can generate an app. And you do that by doing feathers generate app. And it'll ask you some questions. So what do you want to call it? You can give it a description. Let's say a to-dos API. What folder should the source files live in? It defaults to source. I like that. Which package manager do you want to use? I'm going to choose npm. And then you can decide what kind of API you're making. By default, I just leave both of these checked. You can enable or disable them later. But what's really cool about this is once you've created your services, they're available as a RESTful API or as a real-time API where you can get updates when things change, when things get added, when things get deleted, that kind of thing. So I'm going to leave both of these enabled. Yes?
What about like Firebase?
Similar to how Firebase gives you real-time updates when things change, you can get the exact same functionality using FeathersJS. Cool. Which testing framework do you prefer? I like Jest. Raise a hand for Jest. Raise a hand for Mocha-Chai. Please Jest. Cool. Selenium. Okay. So it will expand out all the files, install all of the dependencies, and then you can get up and going. So once the dependencies are installed, we can start it up and see what it looks like. Cool. While that's happening, what do I have next? Yeah, support a transport layer. So I'll talk a bit about this. I already mentioned it. You can create a RESTful API. You can use, so here are your two options for real-time. There's Socket.io and Primus. These are both backend modules that, or backend libraries that allow you to have real-time communication with Node.js. You can choose either or. At the end of the day, your client is still going to communicate with the service in the same way. This is just the protocol that it uses to communicate. I've built a lot of Socket.io applications. That's usually what I choose. But if you choose Primus, your app is going to end up working in the same way once it's all up and going. OK, so it generated the app. We now have this folder structure. And let's just dive in and kind of see what's in here first. Does this work? Cool. So by default, you have these folders here. You have a nice little README that basically tells you how to set it up. You go in the folder, you npm install, you can do npm start. It gives you examples of the different Feathers CLI commands that you can run. And if we take a look in the source directory, there is an index.js. This is our main entry point. If you've ever written a Node.js or Express application, this might look very similar. We're bringing in app. So this is an app defined just like you would an Express application. And then this is doing the listening. Typically, we like to separate our app and our actual file that does the listening so that way we can test it. So if we look at our app.js, this is going to look very, very familiar. So we're bringing in all of our middlewares. Some things to note are that when we bring in Express, we're bringing in a special version of Express that's coming from Feathers. That just has all the features of Express, but also adds that transport layer code and information. And then we're also bringing in Socket.io, but again, from the FeathersJS family, not the default Socket.io. We have our Middleware Services, and then this will look very similar to any Express app that you've ever set up. We have all of our middlewares here. We're using them, and it's all up and ready to go. You'll see some other folders here, and we'll talk a bit more about what those do. I'll also talk about hooks and what they are, but this is just a general idea of what you're getting. If you look in the services folder, this is where any services you generate will go. If you want to create custom middlewares, you can put them here. If you want to create reusable hooks, typically you put them here. When I talk about hooks, I'll show this one. This is just a basic logging middleware, but with Feathers, the way they allow you to basically attach a function to any incoming or outgoing requests is with hooks. And so this is a basic hook that uses, I think it's the Winston logger. Winston to log every incoming and outgoing request, and it shows you a basic example of middlewares. Questions or thoughts so far in what you see? Yes.
If they're like using their own version of Express, Socket.io, etc., how do they keep those up to date?
It's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to, but I do know it is fairly like the latest version. Let's go directly to npm just to see.
Can you just like go straight to the newest version of NPM?
So my guess is they have it installed as a dependency, and then they might actually just add some new properties onto it. But if we look at it on GitHub, we can see in their package JSON that Express is not a dependency. Oh, no, sorry. So the way they have all of this structured is there's the main Feathers repo, and then inside of packages are all of the community packages. So this has the client and auth, and then Feathers is the main one that we're using, and then there's the Express one. So if we look at its package JSON, we can see that it is using Express 4.16.4. What's the latest version of Express? 4.16.4. So it's using the latest version of Express. I haven't really looked at the source code, but my guess is it's a dependency, and then they just add some things on top of it. So yeah, so you don't really have to worry about it going out of date. It's a good question. Cool. Where were we? All right, so let's talk about services. They are at the heart of every FeathersJS application, and they are just JavaScript objects or an instance of a class that implement certain methods. So if you're familiar with CRUD, you'll be familiar with the methods that these services implement. They provide a uniform protocol-independent interface. So what that means is you can define a service using their standard way of defining a service, but under the hood, it could be a RESTful API. Or under the hood, it could be a real-time socket API. To you, the person writing the service, that doesn't matter. It's all hidden from you, and you can write it in just a way that makes sense, and then once you enable one of the protocols, you'll get access to that app and how it works. So services can read or write to a database, they can interact with a file system, they could call some other external API, they can call other services, like other built-in services in your app, like send an email or process a payment, get the current weather location. Services are at the heart of it all, and this is really where your logic goes. And protocol independent means that a Feather service does not matter if it has been called internally through a REST API or WebSockets or any other way. One thing you'll see is if you have services that are dependent on each other, your code to interact with the service is the exact same as the code a client would be using like in the browser, which is pretty cool. It's a beautiful API, but once you've implemented your service in this way, it just works, no matter how you're going to use it. And at its core, they are just CRUD methods that you can implement. So there's find, there's get, create, update, patch, remove. These are the functions that you can basically write yourself. But what I'll show in a second is by default, you could create a CRUD API without having to write any of these functions. You have that built in. And if you want to generate a service, there is a command for that. So we're going to be, right now, we are in our to-dos Feathers app that we created. We're going to do a Feathers generate service. It's going to ask us some questions. I accidentally chose NeDB. I didn't want to do that. But, so your first question is, what kind of a service is it? If you really want something totally custom that's not just a CRUD endpoint that's talking to a database, you could choose that, and then you can implement those functions that I just mentioned on your own. You could have an in-memory store, so instead of actually storing stuff in a database, you could just, you'll have an API with create, read, update, delete, but the moment you restart the server, all the data will be gone. And then there are built-in adapters for all sorts of databases. I think my next slide is on data adapters. Yes. So data adapters are modules that provide services that implement standard CRUD functionality for a specific database using a common API for initialization and settings and providing a common query syntax. So the cool thing about this is each and every one of these services, whether it's NeDB or Mongoose or SQLize or Connects or Objection or Cassandra, under the hood, they're all talking to different databases, but they have an API that's the same for all of them. So the way that you get data or add data is the same regardless of what database you're using under the hood. So if you look at the docs, you can see all of their supported adapters. So there's in-memory. The interesting thing about all of this is I mentioned Feathers has a client. The Feathers client is just the Feathers library itself. So it's written in a way that it can either run inside of a browser or run as a backend API. So you see here that local storage or async storage is a supported database. Async storage is a React Native thing. You could actually have a Feathers service living inside of a React Native app that just stores all the data locally and you're not actually communicating with any external API, which is an interesting add-on there. But through either the native MongoDB driver or Mongoose, you can access MongoDB. Through either Connects or SQLize, you can access all of these SQL databases. And I believe there are even more that aren't listed here. So here are some NoSQL databases. At the end, I'll show awesome FeathersJS, which just gives links to different plugins and a whole list of other data adapters that might not be listed in the official docs. And you can also write your own data adapters. So do I have more to say on this? I don't have any more to say on data adapters, but that's the thing. So let's choose our data adapter. I think in my case, I'll just choose Mongoose, which is a Mongo database adapter. It asks me what is the name of the service. Let's call this to-dos. It's a little weird that I created an app called to-dos and I'm creating a service called to-dos, but I'm only going to have this one service in there. And then what path should the service be registered on? So this is when we make a request to the backend API, what URL do we hit? So here we're going to post /to-dos to create a new to-do. I'll leave it as the default, but you can call it anything you want. It's usually a good practice to keep your services the URL is the same as the name of the service itself. And then what is the database connection string? So because this is the first time I'm generating a service, it's just guess that, hey, we're going to connect to Mongo and connect to a database called to-dos. If I didn't want to do that, I could put in my own URL. But when I generate subsequent services, it'll recognize that I already have a database connection and just use that same database connection. And away it will go. Questions so far? All right, it's about to get really cool, really, really cool. All right, so we have the service. Let's start up the app. You could do npm start, that just does regular like node index.js. You can also do npm run dev, and you get nodemon set up and ready to go. When we visit the app, by default, it's running on port 3030. You can also configure that, and you have the beautiful Feathers app. Now, I want to access that service that I just created, /to-dos. There it is. By default, there's nothing in my database, so I'm just getting back. And by default, it has pagination enabled, so it's telling me I have none in my database. By default, we're limiting 10, and we're skipping 0. Let's look at the code that it generated. So if you look in the folder here, now under services, we have to-dos, which is the service I just created. We have hooks, which I'll talk about, but essentially they allow you to run functions at any point during the lifecycle of a request. So you could do it before, after, or when an error happens of all of those different methods that we mentioned before. And then there's the service itself. So by default, it just uses default pagination. It gets mounted on the / route. This is where you could update that URL manually if you wanted to. And then we're just using the built-in Feathers Mongoose to create a service with those options. So it generates the service, but when you generate a service and you choose a database, it also generates a model. So if you look in your models folder, you get, to-dos.model. And if you've ever used Mongoose, this will look very familiar. This is just a schema definition. So this is where we would define all of the properties of the documents that we're going to be storing in this particular document store. So by default, it just has text, but we could add some other properties in here. Let's do like done. Type is Boolean. I think we can do a default. That would be a Mongoose thing. Does anyone use Mongoose on the regular? Yeah. Do I say default right here? Can I do that? Or default false? Cool. So I have a schema. It has text. It's a string, which is required. It has done, which is false. I could add other things in here. This is just defining how I communicate with the database. You would go to the Mongoose documentation for this. So that's my schema. Now let's actually communicate with the service. So I'm just going to pull up Postman, and we can start adding to-dos. Cool. Okay, so the endpoint that I want to hit is this URL /to-dos. If I do a get here in Postman, we're going to get back that same response, but let's create a to-do. So I'm going to do a post. I need to specify a body. Let's just do some a raw JSON body. So a to-do has text. Our text here is going to be learn FeathersJS. and done is false. So make a post request, and I get back the created to do. It has a Mongo ID, it has a created at and an updated at date. That was due to timestamps being true, so by default, those will get updated automatically. But it got created. So now, if I make a GET request to to-dos, we should see it. Go. And there it is. So in like 2 commands, we have a full CRUD endpoint. It's talking to a database. It's amazing. It's beautiful. Questions, thoughts, comments so far? Cool. Another thing to mention is all of the other operations are available on this. So if I wanted to, for instance, get a to-do with a specific ID, I should be able to do get to-dos/ID. That'll give me back the one with that ID. If I wanted to update a to-do with this ID, I can do a put against that URL. And now in my database, it has an exclamation mark. So if I do a get on all of them, I should see the updated data. So all of the endpoints are there in a standard RESTful API. If I wanted to delete that to do, I can make a delete request against that ID. Cool. What's that? Who is excited about this? Yeah, it's cool, right? 2 commands, you get an API. Yeah. It does, yeah. So this is, I guess, something to show. Do I have Mongotron? What's the MongoDB like official UI? Is Compass? Yeah, I think I have that. Well, I guess I don't. Well, does it I don't know like the CLI commands for Mongo. But the point that I'm making is if we went into MongoDB, we would actually see that there's a document stored with all of this information in it. And then if I do a delete, it actually deletes that row inside of the Mongo database. Yeah. Question?
Oh, you're probably going to do it, but you're going to go to like authentication or you're doing like nested.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is something to think about. So we have this to-dos API, but it's fully open. Anybody can create, read, update, delete a to-do. So you absolutely want auth behind this. You don't want anybody to be able to do it. They should be logged in. Maybe we want to only have when you do a GET request, we only return the to-dos that have a specific user ID or something like that. It's all possible, definitely. Okay. Yes, authentication. So there is a built-in module that assists in using authentication, and it uses JSON Web Tokens under the hood. So the primary purpose of the auth module is to set up a /authentication endpoint. This is where you'll make your request whenever you're logging in. That is configurable, though. If you wanted it to be /login, you could change that. And then that will return a JSON Web Token that can be used in subsequent requests. And it provides a consistent authentication API for all of the transport. So no matter if you're using sockets or REST, you can still authenticate using the same endpoint. And there are various authentication plugins and extra hooks you can use. I'll talk about hooks a bit more later, but these are things like making sure that only the user that created an entity can delete that entity, things like that, and that's all built in. So we want to add auth. This is the command that we run. I guess I'll just do it on this to-dos app here. Cool. So this is the same one that we generated the service on. We're going to generate authentication in that same app. And we can choose. So it has some default providers here in the CLI, so Google, Facebook, GitHub, but all of these are using Passport.js. So you could install one of these to see how it gets hooked in and set up. But if you wanted to add some provider like Twitter that's not listed here, it's just a matter of adding that Passport provider. I'm going to use username and password by default. And then what is the name of the user entity service? So when you generate authentication, it also needs a service, so that way we can create new users. And we could call this anything we want. I'll just call it users because that makes sense. But essentially to sign up, you make a post request against users, send your user data, and that creates a new user. Where do we want to store it? Let's store it in the same database as before. And because in a previous service I had already chosen my database connection, it didn't ask that again. It just knows to connect to the same database as the other service. Cool. Yeah. Okay, so now we have auth. Let's see what happened. It generated this authentication.js file. This is where all of it is configured. if you want to customize this even more, if you want to change how what properties are inside of the JSON Web Token or how that gets generated, this is where you would do all of that work. But what we want now is that we should not be able to create to-dos unless we're logged in. So if we look at our to-dos service here, and actually to-dos hooks, we basically want to add a hook so that before any method that happens, we want to make sure that you're logged in, right? And that's essentially how hooks will work. We'll add the authentication hook here before all, and it will ensure that you have a JSON Web Token, otherwise it will return unauthorized. We could just figure out what to require in and add the function there, but what's interesting is if we just regenerate that service, the to-do service, it will automatically add that. And I kind of did this out of order because I wanted to show services first, but typically you would add authentication first, because then any service you add after that, it's going to ask you, do you want to add auth to this service? You just say yes, and it automatically adds that middleware. So let's just recreate the to-dos. I don't know if it's going to overwrite my model. I'm just going to copy it because this is the only thing I changed. So to-dos there. Does this service require authentication? Yes. Yeah, it's going to overwrite my model. But yes, just go ahead and do it. Actually, I could have told it no, because nothing would have changed in the model. I should have just said no. But do I want to overwrite hooks? Yes, because that's the blank file. And typically, you would only generate the service after you generated auth, so you wouldn't run into these overwrite issues, but just showing how that happens. Let's put our, in our to-dos model, let's put our properties back. But you'll see when the authentication service generated, it also generated a user's model, and by default, users just have an email and password. If I wanted to add other properties in here, it would just be a matter of updating the schema. But now, if we look at the to-do hooks, we can see that before all, we call authenticate with JSON Web Token. So now, before you can request to-dos, before you can create to-dos, you must be logged in. And it's as simple as that. I do have NodeMon running, so it should have automatically restarted. So now, if I try to request all to-dos, not authenticated, no auth token. So it's now protecting all of those routes, and you must be logged in. I could also try to delete this to-do. Actually, did I do that earlier? I don't know if I did or not, but I should still get in not authenticated because I don't have a token. So now we need to create a user. It created that user's service for us, so we'll make the request there. And the body of our request will need to have, if we look back at the schema, email and password. And the other thing is, under the hood, it automatically uses bcrypt to hash those passwords. So need our email. We need, what's the other one? Password. Password 123. Okay. So when I click, oh no, I don't want to do get, I want to do a post. So this is going to create a new user in the system so that I can then log in with that user later on. So I'm going to do a post here. We now have that user created. One thing we could try to do really quick is just to get all users in the system. But by default, that is authenticated. Let's look at the users hooks to see how that's working. Cool. So here's another example of a hook that we're seeing is the hash password hook. So before create, hash the password. Before update, hash the password. Before patch, hash the password. So this is a hook that comes for free in the authentication module that automatically hashes the incoming password whenever it gets updated. You could write your own hooks that do similar things, that use a different algorithm if you wanted to. But the user's endpoint itself is protected so that no non-logged in users can't just request any and all of the users. We can see some other hooks in here like protect. And so what this does is in any response, so this is after, so when the response is coming back to the client, it will remove the password field from the outgoing response because you don't want to like send your hash passwords back to users. So that one is protected. We can't do that. But let's try to log in. So now that we've created this user, we can do a post request against /authenticate, or is it authentication? Authentication.
Can you override that
endpoint? Yes, definitely. So the login endpoint? Yeah. Yeah, and let's just let's see where that is handled right now. Pretty sure it's going to be like an app.use. There's a way to override it. It probably is in the configuration right here. App.get authentication. And if we look in the config, yeah. So yeah, here it is. So in the config folder, there's a JSON file with lots of stuff. I haven't showed this yet, but right here is where you would change that. So if you want that to be /auth/login, you would just change it right here. Pretty sure you need to restart your server, but that's what the path would be. The other thing we see here is the secret that it's using to sign and verify JSON web tokens. This is just like a default generated secret. You can also use environment variables in here. So if I just did JWT_secret, part of loading in this config is to see, is there an environment variable that is named that? And if it is, it'll replace that. So you don't need to commit things like this to your Git repo. And then you also have options for the JSON web token that it generates. So what is the audience, the subject, the issuer? Let's change all of this. Let's call this the Node.js Denver Meetup. Subject, logged in, issuer, CJ. You can specify your algorithm, how long before the JSON web token expires. So now that we have all of that, did it restart? Let's just restart it to make sure. And let's try logging in. So we'll do a post against /authentication. We're going to send it JSON data. And it's basically going to be this information, because this is what we'll use to log in. So please log me in. This is my email. This is my password. That's not right. Did I spell it right? Raw body, application JSON, go.
That before auth wouldn't run before auth. It was auth.
It shouldn't, yeah. So the way the auth service is configured, and if we look at app.hooks, so app.hooks are your main hooks. This runs before every single request. This is only doing logs. To-dos, this is for creating, reading, updating to-dos, and then users as well. I'm going to go to the docs real quick and see what I'm doing wrong. So if we look at authentication, that's the config that we messed with. We can tap into events. Let's look at the client. So usually the client docs here are just using the FeathersJS library rather than just doing an actual post request. So this might not actually have it. Let's look in the guides. Let's look in auth, authentication API. Yeah, so set up an authentication endpoint, create tokens. Should just work. So get a token. To create a JSON web token, we make a... Oh, we have to tell it the strategy. Yeah, okay. So I am specifying email and password, but right now it just didn't know that, hey, I'm trying to do local auth. I guess the point there is if you had other strategies enabled, you would specify that if it was like Google or some of those other strategies. What's that? I would think so, and I think that might actually happen in here. So like before create, let's look at config.strategies. That's where it says what we support, JSON Web Token or local. But so the difference there is local is when you're creating your token, so when you actually want to generate a token, and then later on if you're authenticating and you have a generated token, you would use the strategy JWT. But this should work. There we go, and we get back a JSON Web Token. So now we'll just hold on to this, and this is what we can use to make authenticated requests. If you look back at the docs, it'll tell us where that token needs to be. So when we generated the to-do service, we already added that hook, which authenticates with JSON Web Token. So now, let's see. Yeah, so we need to add it to the authorization header. So if I wanted to request all to-dos, right now, I don't have a token, so there's nothing. But if I add an authorization header, so I say authorization, and this is using JSON Web Token, so you use bearer and then specify your token. And now we can get all users. So now you must be logged in to be able to get all users. And same thing for create, read, update, delete. Cool. Thoughts, comments, questions? Awesome, yeah. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of talking, but it really is only like 4 commands. Cool.
For the job token, do you customize like the expiration date somewhere?
Yeah, so you can change when it expires, what algorithm it uses. If you want to get more complex than that, so like by default it uses, I guess it's, I forget what it's called, but it's like a one-way signing. So there's no way for a client to verify that a token is valid. But there's another algorithm you can use where you have a public key shared on the client and it can verify it. I believe if you wanted to get that custom with it, you'd have to drop in here and add the custom verifier there. So I did a stream a while back where I built a Trello clone using Feathers, and I wanted to customize what properties actually came back in the JSON Web Token, and I ended up actually having to create a custom JWT service thing that I used here instead of JWT. So if you want to get really custom with it, you can, but for the basic properties, if you want to mess with those, that would just be in your config here. Yeah, so you could change this to a week. There's a way to also say never expire.
There's also a payload, I think, to include bodies or just a string in there.
In terms of like adding extra things to it?
Yeah, actually I think it might have been a JSON string of a subject or something like that.
Cool. There's a question in the chat. In what condition will you choose something else instead of Feathers? It varies. So like at work, I build Node.js APIs, and I haven't used FeathersJS there, mainly because we have existing APIs, and we kind of have an internal way of structuring things. We kind of do like feature by folder. I think if you want to be really, really custom without having to structure things in the way that Feathers wants you to structure them, that's probably when you would like go your own way of writing things. But it does actually provide a lot. I think this is really the question you have to ask yourself when you're deciding, do you want to build up your own framework using various libraries, or do you want to use something pre-existing? Like when it comes to configuring it more, you're going to have a harder time when things are preset. That said, it really is fairly easy to extend Feathers and create your own custom hooks and to modify incoming and outgoing requests. So I think it varies. And it really is just up to you and your team and like what you prefer. Cool. What's next? Hooks. Yeah, we've been talking about them. But they are essentially pluggable middleware functions that can be registered before, after, or on errors. So I've been showing them several different times. And I guess a good example of it was the user service, or sorry, the user's hooks, which has a ton of them in here. So basically, before you can search for a user, you must be authenticated with JWT. Before you can get a user, you must be authenticated with JWT. If we wanted to add a hook that says, when you get a user, you should only be able to get the user that has your user ID that you're logged in with, we could add another hook right here that does that. Is there a question? Yeah? No? Okay, no worries. So when we create, we hash the password. I think I'll just go ahead and create like a custom middleware to kind of show you, or a custom hook to show you how that works. Let's do it for the to-dos. So let's say after find, we're going to add like an emoji property to every to-do, because why not? So we want a hook here. We could define it separately and import it in, but you can also just define the function inline. And if we take a look at the hook that they've written here, this is a function that returns a function that accepts the context, but we can just write an inline function that takes context as an argument. So this takes in the context, and then it can do something with it. So basically, if this function either throws an error, or if it returns a promise and the promise rejects, will result in an error being sent back. But if no error is thrown here, then it will basically just continue down the chain to go to potentially any other hooks that are in place. Let's just log the context to see what we get access to when our incoming request is happening. I'm going to disable all of this logging that's happening. I haven't shown it, actually, or was it not enabled? Yeah, I think logging wasn't enabled to begin with. So now that I have this hook in the after of every to-do request, and actually we don't want it to be in all, I want this to be like in find. So like when you find all of them, when we're returning an array of them, we're gonna like add a property to every single one that's coming back. So now that I have that hook there, we can actually watch the request as it happens. So I'm going to request all to-dos, go, and we see this big thing log. That's basically the context. So in the context, it's probably not the best way to show it, but you have access to the service that your hooks are in. So context.service, in this case, is literally the to-dos service. So I could do context.service.find. I could use all of these methods internally inside of a hook. You have access to the Express apps. You can get configuration variables and things like that. Let's go to the docs because they probably have a better way to show it. So if we look at API and then hooks. So the hook context has access to the app. That's essentially your Express application. So if you want to do things like app.get, etc., you can do that. The service is the service that the hook is happening on. Path is the path of the request. Method is whether it was a find, get, create, update, patch, or remove. You have access to params, so you can look at if there were configurable params like ID or something like that. You can look at data. So data is a writable property containing the data of a create, update, and patch. So what this would allow you to do is in potentially the before hook of a create or the before hook of an update, you can modify the data that is about to be updated. You could run some calculations. You basically have access to the entity that is about to be updated with that request. You can specify an error. Result, I believe, is the thing that's going to be passed back. So let's actually just log context.result. Let's see it happen. So let's make a request. And now we actually have access to that thing that it's about to send back. So we could modify that outgoing request. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to iterate over result. And then just say to-do dot emoji is a little smiley face. Let's do a cat smiley. Cool. So I'm actually modifying the outgoing result. So the thing that we get back in Postman should now have a nice little emoji property. Result.for, oh, so I need to do result.data.forEach. Okay. Nice, we have our little emoji hook. So you have access to modify the outgoing data. You have access to modify the incoming data. Let's see if there is anything else worth mentioning. You could change the outgoing status code. So this is essentially what lets you tap into all of these requests and responses and modify them to your heart's content to do more custom things than just the built-in way services are handled. Questions, thoughts, comments on this? Yes, sir.
What's the attach hook?
What would you? Oh, like what is like the?
Yeah, what's that attach hook?
So this is when you're updating, but you're not updating all of the properties. So you've made and this is aligns with how it's defined in RESTful APIs. So typically an update request would be a post, and that means you're sending all of the properties of that entity, even ones that aren't changing. Patch allows you to only change a single property. So if I were to, I guess let's just do it real quick. Let's change this to be a patch. We're going to update the to-do with this ID. And we're going to set only one property. So typically an update, I would have to specify both done and text. But with a patch, I could just say text. Need to make sure it's JSON. Go. What? Oh, thanks. Close. I was close. There we go. And so a patch just lets you send like one property, so you don't have to know all of the properties of the object to be able to update it. Cool. What else did I want to say about hooks? Yeah, it's transport independent. So I talked about this earlier, but it doesn't matter if we're using REST or sockets or Primus. Your hooks are always defined in the same way. They can always modify the incoming and outgoing request, and they'll always behave in the same way, but the way the client ultimately gets that data will change. But the way you define them is exactly the same. Yeah, so you can do things like validation, logging, populating related entities, sending notifications. So you could basically add a hook on create. So anytime a to-do is created, post to the Twilio API to send someone a text that says like, hey, a to-do was created. But you have full power to do all this. And this is an array of functions, so I define the function right there. But if I wanted to define more hooks, it's just a matter of adding them into the array. And these will get called one after another. Cool. That's hooks. Questions, thoughts, comments? Easy, yeah. Cool. Feathers client. All right, so I've been using Postman, but let's just make like a very simple front-end app that uses the Feathers service to make to-dos, to interact with the service. So one of the most notable features of Feathers is that it can also be used on the client. In contrast with most other frameworks, it isn't a separate library. So I mentioned this earlier. In the browser, you're literally using the same Feathers library that creates the services. The only difference is you specify a transport for whenever to tell it that it needs to send those requests somewhere rather than just doing it locally. But in the client, you could specify hooks, you could specify plugins. So on the client side, you could have a before create hook that as the request is going out, like before it's sent to the service, you can modify that outgoing entity. Cool. And let's do it. So I'm just going to create like a basic like vanilla JavaScript app. We could do it in the public folder, could create it in a separate folder. Let's just do it in the public folder because that gets served up by default anyways. Like when you visit localhost 3000, this is just static HTML being served from the public folder. So right here, let's create a to-dos file, to-dos.html. We'll throw in some HTML. We'll say to-dos. Could bring in some CSS. For now, let's just say hello world. And we should be able to get to it. So if we go to /todos.html, there's our static HTML file. So now I'm gonna bring in a script file. So let's just call this client.js. And in here, I'm actually gonna pull in FeathersJS from a CDN so that I can create a client instance to communicate with the to-dos API. So let's go to their docs. If we look at API client usage, I believe, so they show how to install it. Like you could install it in your React app, but this would be like NPM dependencies. You could use it in a separate backend Node app, but just to show how it works really quick, you pull in Feathers itself and then whatever transport you want to use. You tell it, you create that transport and tell it what it's talking to. You create a client. You configure it with that transport. If you wanted to use REST, you would bring the REST transport in instead. And then you have access to all of your services that are defined on the back end. So in our case, we would say client.service to-dos. And now we have this to-dos service. And we can listen for, because we're using the real-time transport, we can listen for when to-dos are created or when they're deleted. And to create a new to-do, we would just do to-do service.create. And that handles all of the post requests and everything else under the hood. So let me find it from a CDN. So load from a CDN like this. So what is core.js? I don't think I need that. You don't know what core.js is?
It's a polyfill for a bunch of ES6 stuff and array methods.
Okay, I don't need that. We're using Chrome. So we're bringing in Feathers. We're bringing in Socket.io. Both of these are just client-side libraries pulled in from a CDN. And then we'll do some stuff like this. So let's add our script tag below it. We're just going to bring in client.js. and then client.js is going to do all of this. So we have our socket connection using socket.io, and we're just telling it, hey, our server is at localhost 3030. We need to create a new Feathers app. And then we need to tell it that it should use the socket protocol. And we're also telling it that it should use authentication. I believe we're going to have to log in before we can do, and typically what you would do is store this in a variable. So say something like const to-dos service equals app.service to-dos. And this just matches the name of the service on the back end. Let me double check that I'm doing that right. Yeah. So app.service to-dos, we created our to-do service, and now we want to like create a to-do or something like that. We need to log in first, so let's take a look at how we do that. So on the client, we'll need to bring in that CDN as well, the authentication client, I think. Let's see. It might be that by default, because we're bringing in the whole library, we have access to .authentication. Yeah, and then we specify options. Right now, it's not passing in any options. By default, it's using all of those default options that we had specified in our backend. So because we didn't change any of those, we don't need to change it. But if we change the path, we'd have to change. In here, you would pass an object that says, like, what path are we hitting, different things like that. But we should be good because most everything is by default. And now we do app.authenticate. In this case, we're going to want to straight up do a login. So we'll say app.authenticate, strategy is local. We probably want to, I've been talking for like an hour now. I don't think I'm going to build a full like client-side app, but you would have like a form that takes a user's username and password, and then you would have JavaScript that would run that would put in the user's username and their password. But what happens under the hood here is if there's a successful login, it just sets a cookie with that JSON Web Token in it so that any subsequent requests automatically use authentication. So let's just hard code it. You would never do this ever because we're going to put my password like in the client-side code. But this should log us in, and we can see, we'll look in the browser and see that a cookie is actually set. Okay, so we're on this page. If we look in application and we take a look at cookies, this might be from like other apps, but by default there's like this IO cookie. If you look at local storage, there's nothing, but when I refresh the page, because I've just put this code right here, it's going to attempt to send the authentication request, and then if it's successful, it's going to set that cookie. So refresh the page. Okay, now if we look at cookies, if we look at local storage, well, it does say we did it. I might have to refresh this. It might actually just be this IO cookie that's getting set here. I don't think it is. It should be the full JSON Web Token. Is it session storage? Okay. Regardless, it did say it was successful, so let's just assume that it was. But actually, you know what? This might actually give us back the token, and we need to store it ourselves. Let me see. So we actually log this result. Yeah. So it actually gives us the token, and then we would need to store it and then authenticate our subsequent requests. I feel like it should handle this. I feel like it's handled this in the past, but regardless, that's your authentication code. Let's just show really quick how I would make a to-do from the client side. So I would do something like to-dos service dot create.
Do you have to do that on a server? Is actually return the AWT and a cookie?
I don't think so. Like, it should handle it. Like in the past when I'll mention this in a second, but there are other client libraries. So I've used this with Vuex and Vue.js. And it has like a wrapper library where you can use authentication it's automatically setting the token. I don't think you have to do it manually. We'll see what happens here. We may need to, once we have the token, call authenticate with JWT, and then that stores a cookie. That's my hunch. Let me try that really quick before we try to do to-do service. This seems pretty wonky though, because we just logged in with the local thing. But this should be result.access token. So we're going to do local auth, and then that'll give us back a token, and then we'll do JWT auth. Let's see what happens. Nothing new. Populate access token. So, okay, here they're doing, oh, I got it. Right here, you have to tell it to store it in local storage. So right here. Yeah. That's how you do local storage, right? It's just complaining because it can't find that variable, but local storage is just local storage. Okay, I think this should work now.
Yes, once you know, Node doesn't understand.
Yeah, it doesn't know what it is. There it is. Okay, cool. So when you configure the auth client, you need to tell it like, hey, where should we store this token? So now, by default, it stores it as Feathers JWT, and you see that it just put the token there. And so after I'm authenticated, now I can start making requests. So let's say we have like an init function, and then down here in our init function, we can do things like create a to-do. So I would say something like to-do service.create. We want the text to be learn feathers client. It should be done by default. I believe this returns a promise, so we could use like async await. And that should just create the to-do. And so under the hood, it's actually going to use sockets to communicate with that service to create the to-do. So when I refresh the page, it created it, and it got back the response. So this was not how you would write a Feathers client, but just showing you like what you have access to. And in a real app, you would use this, but in conjunction with your app as a whole, you have access to all of these services. I'll show some really cool libraries, and like one of the things I used with Vue.js was, I think it was called like Feathers Plus or something like that, but it actually gave you client-side models, so you could say new to-do, and then pass in its properties. And then if you say to-do.save, that automatically calls the service under the hood. It's a beautiful thing, but that's the client library. Okay, thoughts, comments, questions on this? Nope, cool, all right. Ecosystem and community. So they do have a frequently asked questions page. So, and they answer a lot of very, very common questions. So like, I want to modify this specific thing in this certain way. They probably answer that in their frequently asked questions here. Why are you using JWT for sessions? And it explains why they made that choice. What about Koa or Happy? So check out the FAQ. They also have a blog, they have a Slack where you can ask questions, and then there is awesome FeathersJS. So this is just a catalog of all of the community-created plugins, the data adapters, an Angular plugin, a React plugin, like a Redux plugin, a Vue plugin, all of the things. Actually, is this?
Hey guys.
Cool. So videos that link to how to make Feathers apps, some example apps using React and MobX, or Feathers 2 and Vue 2, or Feathers and Apollo, all the things. They list some projects that use it. And then for database, so this is all of the supported, not supported, but this includes community plugins for talking to databases. There's tons and tons of them. You can document your API using Feathers Swagger. I've done a little bit of that where it can automatically infer from the service like what are the endpoints, and basically your documentation gets generated automatically with very little configuration. built-in mailing, and then they do have, the front-end frameworks section. So you could technically just bring in the FeathersJS client library and use it the way I was using it, but just inside of Vue components or React components, or in your Redux store in like async actions. But there are community-created plugins that make it really, really easy to integrate. So there's Feathers Action, which allows you to use Feather services in Redux. All of these are for React and Redux. Feathers Vuex is one that I used in one of the videos that I created, and it is a beautiful thing. I guess I just want to show really quick like how cool the API is for it. So inside of your app, you would have set it up and say, hey, we're talking to this Feather service, and then you have access to all of your services. It automatically, I think you do have to tell it what's available, but once you've done that, then you can destructure off of Feathers VX and get access to your services by name. And then you can do like service.find. And then when you want to create an instance, you can say, I was just like talking about this, but this is what it would look like. You say new to do, and then if you say to-do.save, that returns a promise, but under the hood, it's actually like calling the API. Zoom in? Yeah, sure. So you would create your to-do and then say like to-do.save, to-do.create, and that's an even like higher level API than having to say to-do.create and like passing in your data. It gives you more of like a model's way of interacting with the data. So that's cool. That's all I had there. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
I noticed in the CLI there wasn't an option for TypeScript. How easy would it be to integrate TypeScript into?
I think somebody's tried to do it. So there is this thing called Feathers Plus. I tried using this. To me, it just seemed a little bit convoluted to get up and going, but they have essentially wrapped the generator and allow you to generate an app that uses TypeScript. They also have added, I think there is a GraphQL plugin for like regular Feathers, but in Feathers Plus, wait, is this it? Extensions. I don't know if this is it. There's, people have tried. I wouldn't say it's officially supported, but yes, you can do it. Let's just search really quick for like Feathers TypeScript.
It's kind of, there's not like a community way. It's kind of more up to you to like.
Just change your name files to
Let's see. So actually, there is a plugin. So TypeScript definition for Feathers. So these are just, I guess, type definitions. It's not actually like using TypeScript. But if you did decide to use TypeScript, you would get autocomplete and like suggestions for all the different modules. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. TypeScript starter. So somebody else has a FeathersJS starter app built using Feathers, TypeScript, and Swagger for hackathons. So I would say people have done it, but as far as I can tell, like in the official documentation, I haven't seen anything on it. Yeah, experimental TypeScript definitions, but not really anything with for creating your services and things like that. Other questions? Cool. I'm getting clap emojis in the live chat. Andrew Lane asks, what's the difference between io.connect and io? This is in reference to like when you're creating a socket connection. I don't think there's a difference. I think both of them will accept the server that you want to connect to. Yeah, I would say they both work in the same way. Yeah, someone else in the chat said no difference. Cool. That was me. All of the slides, links, everything is at that URL, git.io/intro-feathers. Reach out to me in all these places. Thank you.
It's like class all over again.
Goodbye.
Thanks for
Here, thank you.
See you tomorrow.
See you later. Thanks for watching.